Congratulations, you have just woken up in the middle of the night in a town where no one locks their doors. There is no memory of arrival, no sensation of travel, no clear moment where one place ended and this one began. Only the quiet understanding that you are here now, awake when you should not be, surrounded by buildings that feel lived in, but not alert. You sit up slowly, because the silence suggests that sudden movement would be noticed, though you cannot yet explain by whom. The street outside is narrow, lined with houses built close enough that their shadows overlap, their doors shut not with intention but with habit, their windows dark in the way that suggests sleep rather than abandonment. You realize after a moment that stretches longer than expected that nothing here is secured. No iron catches, no bolts, no bars hidden in the wood. If you were to stand, cross the street, and place your hand against any door you see, it would open as easily as it did the night before, and the night before that, and every night before those. Welcome to the Silent Archive. This is not a place for events that announce themselves loudly or demanded to be remembered. It is where quiet survivals are stored, where habits that once made sense are preserved long after the reasons for them have disappeared. Tonight's record is a town that lived for generations without locks, not because its people believed themselves better than others, and not because they trusted blindly, but because the concept of intrusion had never taken shape strongly enough to require a response. The town is small, though not intentionally so, positioned far enough from major roads that movement around it feels optional rather than inevitable, and distant enough from trade that those who passed through rarely lingered long enough to leave an impression. There was nothing here that attracted attention, no warehouses, no stored wealth, no symbols of authority. Only homes, arranged according to familiarity rather than defense, and routines that repeated themselves so faithfully they stopped being noticed. Doors were closed at night because the air cooled quickly once the sun disappeared, and windows were latched because the wind could be unpredictable. But the idea that a door might need to resist a person never emerged fully enough to change the way the town was built. Children grew up learning the interiors of other houses as naturally as their own, not out of curiosity, but because boundaries had never been formalized, and neighbors entered and exited one another's spaces without ceremony, explanation, or concern. Borrowing was casual. Returning was assumed. And because nothing had ever happened to contradict this way of living, the absence of locks became invisible, folded into daily life so completely that it stopped being a choice and became a condition. You can feel that condition now, standing here in the dark, the strange calm of a place that has never rehearsed fear, and therefore does not recognize its early symptoms. The town did not think of itself as safe. It simply did not think of danger. That is what made the change so difficult to notice. The first sign did not arrive dramatically, and it did not demand attention. A man woke early one morning to find his front door open, the pale light of dawn reaching further into his home than it usually did, illuminating a section of floor that was normally shaded until later in the day. He stood there for a while, trying to remember if he had stepped outside the night before, or if the wind had shifted unexpectedly, though he could not recall hearing it. There was no damage, no missing property. So he closed the door, adjusted it slightly in its frame, and continued with his morning. The explanation did not need to be convincing. It only needed to be available. Days later, another household noticed muddy impressions near their threshold, irregular and partially smudged, as if whoever made them had paused, then changed their mind, leaving the marks behind unintentionally. An animal, they decided. Something passing through. The thought was accepted quickly, because accepting it required no further action. No one spoke of these things openly, not because they were secrets, but because they had not yet become stories, and without a story, there was nothing to share. In towns like this, silence is not avoidance. It is maintenance. Once a concern is spoken aloud, it becomes something that must be addressed, and addressing it would mean admitting that the past was no longer a reliable guide for the present. So the town waited. At night, people began waking without knowing why, their eyes opening into darkness that felt subtly different, heavier somehow, as if it now contained more than it used to. There were no sounds to explain it. No footsteps. No voices. Just the sense that something else had already been awake for some time. You may feel it now as well, that faint unease that arrives without reason and settles into the body before the mind can argue against it. The understanding that whatever the night contains is no longer purely empty. Weeks passed without escalation. Nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. That absence became its own presence. Whatever was moving through the town was not searching, not wandering, and not uncertain. It behaved as though it already knew the layout of the streets, the rhythm of the homes, and the difference between what would be noticed immediately and what could wait. And then one morning, someone found something inside their home that did not belong there. Not hidden. Not forced into view. Placed. Small enough to be overlooked at first. Ordinary enough to raise questions only after it had been noticed, as if it had been left there with patience rather than urgency. This was the moment when silence stopped being useful. Neighbors gathered, standing closer than usual, speaking quietly not because they were afraid of being overheard, but because raising their voices felt inappropriate for something that had entered their lives so gently. Details aligned in uncomfortable ways. Open doors. Marks at thresholds. Objects that no one recognized. The conclusion formed slowly, but once it did, it settled heavily over the town. Someone had been entering their homes at night, not to steal, not to damage, but to move through them unnoticed, long enough to leave proof only after it was too late to deny. Locks were mentioned for the first time. The word felt unfamiliar, almost excessive, as if it belonged to another kind of place entirely, one that required divisions this town had never needed. At first, nothing permanent was done. Furniture was moved in front of doors before sleep. Wedges were carved hastily from spare wood and pressed into place with the hope that they would not be tested. These were not solutions. They were delays. And the night, patient as it had always been, continued to observe. The wedges worked at first, or at least they appeared to. And in a town that had learned to survive on appearances, that distinction mattered more than certainty. People slept again, though lightly, waking at small sounds they would once have ignored, listening to the house settle, to wood responding to temperature, to the distant movements of animals that no longer blended into the night as easily as they once had. Morning conversations resumed their familiar shape, but something subtle had changed in their rhythm. As if each exchange now carried an unspoken footnote, a shared understanding that whatever had entered their lives had not announced itself loudly enough to justify panic, but not quietly enough to be forgotten. No one admitted fear. They spoke instead of tiredness, of poor sleep, of weather that seemed to shift without warning. But when people stood at their doors before bed, placing furniture with more care than necessary, pressing wedges more firmly into place, they lingered there longer than before, listening, as if the house itself might offer reassurance if given enough time. It did not. The nights grew denser, not darker, but fuller, as though the town were now sharing its hours of sleep with something else that did not require rest. Dogs began to react strangely, barking not in bursts but in single, sharp sounds, then falling silent as if interrupted mid-thought, leaving their owners awake with questions that could not be answered by looking out into empty streets. Lanterns burned unevenly. Footsteps carried farther than expected. And still, no one saw anything. That absence became deliberate. It suggested restraint. There is a difference between being unseen and choosing not to be seen. And over time, the town began to sense that whatever moved through it understood that difference well. People began to test their precautions in small ways, not consciously, but through habit, through inconsistency, leaving a wedge slightly loose one night, forgetting furniture another, as though some part of them wanted confirmation that the threat was real, that the change they felt had a cause that could be named. Confirmation arrived quietly. One evening, a family returned home later than usual, delayed by weather and conversation, arriving well after dark to a house that appeared undisturbed, its windows dark, its door exactly as they had left it. Inside, nothing was missing. No drawers opened, no belongings disturbed. But the wedge they had placed carefully against the door before leaving had been removed and set aside, not discarded, not damaged, but placed neatly against the wall, as though whoever moved it had taken the time to consider where it belonged. This detail mattered. It suggested not only entry, but but intention. The wedge had not been forced free. It had been understood. That night, no one slept deeply. The following morning, locks were no longer a hypothetical discussion. They were necessary. The town did not call a meeting, because meetings imply structure and authority, and this place had always operated without either in any formal sense. But word spread quickly, carried not by urgency but by inevitability. Locks began to appear within days, scavenged, improvised, installed unevenly by hands that had never needed to secure a door against another person before. Some doors gained metal fixtures that caught awkwardly, others relied on internal bars, thick pieces of wood set into brackets with more hope than confidence. Uniformity was not achieved. Visibility was. For the first time, the town looked different at night. Doors closed with intention now, producing sharper sounds, final sounds, the kind that do not invite reopening without consequence. The shift was immediate. Signs of entry stopped. No more open doors in the morning. No more unfamiliar objects left behind. The wedges were no longer tested. But relief did not arrive with the silence. It lingered just out of reach, replaced by something harder to define. The sense that whatever had been moving through the town had not been chased away, but had simply learned the limits of its access. Withdrawal is not the same as departure. Life continued, because it had to. Children adapted quickly, learning not to enter homes without permission, absorbing the new rules as though they had always existed, while older residents felt the change more deeply, not because it was inconvenient, but because it redefined something they had believed fundamental. The town survived. That much is clear. There were no recorded confrontations, no injuries, no moments dramatic enough to anchor the story firmly in history. What remained instead were habits that no one could fully justify. Doors checked twice. Windows tested before sleep. Lanterns kept within reach longer than necessary. Years passed. Visitors noticed nothing unusual, and those who lived there learned not to speak of the period when locks had been introduced, not out of secrecy, but because the story did not resolve cleanly enough to be told with confidence. There was no ending to point to, no explanation to offer, only the knowledge that something had changed the town permanently without ever revealing itself fully enough to be understood. Even now, if you walk these streets in daylight, the place feels ordinary, unremarkable. Its houses close but not defensive. Its people polite but reserved, as though some shared understanding sits just beneath the surface of conversation. But at night, when the town grows quiet again, there is a pause before sleep that was not always there. A moment where people listen not for sounds, but for changes in the absence of sound, for the subtle shift that once signaled that something else had already been awake. You are still here. Still awake. And the record has not yet finished speaking. What ultimately placed this town into the silent archive was not what happened there, but what never could be confirmed, despite years of reflection, retelling, and the slow erosion of memory that usually softens such things. No name was ever attached to the presence that moved through the town at night, not because no one tried, but because every attempt to describe it reduced something essential, turning certainty into speculation and experience into rumor. Some believed it had been a traveler who learned the town's habits too well, someone who arrived quietly, stayed longer than expected, and departed only when the environment no longer allowed easy movement, leaving behind nothing more than the imprint of having been there. Others thought it had been more than one person, though no evidence supported coordination, and no pattern ever emerged that suggested multiple intentions acting together. There were also those who suspected it had been someone from the town itself, a possibility spoken only in abstract terms, because to consider it seriously would have required dismantling trust that had taken generations to form. But no accusations were made. No investigations followed. The town had learned by then that not everything becomes clearer when examined closely. What is certain is that the presence never returned in the same way. Years passed without incident, and the memory of unlocked doors slowly transformed from lived experience into story, and from story into something closer to folklore, repeated without urgency, often without detail, and eventually without emotion. Children heard it as a curiosity. Visitors heard it as a peculiarity. Only those who had lived through it understood what had truly been lost, because what disappeared was not safety. It was innocence. Before that period, the town had believed that danger was something external, something that arrived loudly and announced itself clearly enough to be confronted or avoided. Afterward, they understood something far more difficult. That harm does not always arrive with force. That intrusion does not require destruction. That sometimes being observed without permission is enough to alter a place forever. The locks remained, they rusted, were replaced, improved, standardized, until eventually no one remembered the exact reason they had been installed in the first place. They became background objects, folded once again into daily life, just as the absence of locks had once been. History does this often. It preserves outcomes while erasing causes. The Silent Archive exists for moments like this, not to provide answers, but to prevent certain questions from disappearing entirely. Because unanswered questions have a way of shaping behavior long after their origin is forgotten. This town did not fall. It did not collapse or empty out or earn a warning on a map. It continued, quietly, adjusting itself around a lesson that had no clear author and no clear conclusion. And that is why it remains here. Because somewhere between the open doors of its past and the locked doors of its present lies a truth that history rarely records clearly. That security is often adopted not after catastrophe, but after discomfort, after the realization that something has been allowed too long simply because it had always been allowed. You are still in the Silent Archive now. The record is complete. Nothing further needs to be explained. The doors in this place are closed, not because something is expected to happen, but because once something did. And history, having learned the habit, did not let it go. This entry will remain unresolved, unchallenged, and quietly intact. End of record. The Silent Archive.